In the heart of the lush land of Kawuna, where the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh banana bread, there lived two extraordinary people whose paths had never crossed. Eric, the wealthiest man in Kawuna, owned the largest coffee plantation in the entire region. His mansion sat high on a hill, surrounded by endless rows of coffee bushes with bright red cherries, glistening like jewels under the sun. Eric was handsome, tall, and always dressed in fine clothes. But his heart was restless. Despite all his wealth, he found life dull and predictable. He often hosted lavish parties where the richest men in the village came to boast about their fortunes. At one such gathering, Eric's childhood friend and closest rival, Kofi, proposed a challenge. "Eric," Kofi said, his voice loud and teasing, "you say you can charm any woman in this village, but I doubt you can win the heart of Grace, the bakery owner." The room went silent. Everyone had heard of Grace. She was a kind woman, full of laughter and life, but she did not fit the village's idea of beauty. She was a large woman with round cheeks, a full figure, and hands that always smelled of flour and bananas. Grace ran her bakery, Grace's Oven, with a heart full of passion. She used only local ingredients, supporting the farmers in Kawuna, and her banana bread was said to be the best in the land. Eric chuckled, brushing off the challenge at first. "Grace is a lovely woman, but why her?" he asked, pouring himself another cup of steaming coffee. Kofi leaned forward, a mischievous grin on his face. "Because she doesn't care about money or status. She's too wise for your charm." "I dare you, Eric. Prove me wrong." The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, and Eric, never one to back down from a challenge, agreed. "Fine," he said, raising his cup. "I'll win Grace's heart. But remember, Kofi, when I do, you'll owe me your finest herd of cattle." "It's a deal," Kofi replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. And so the wager was set. Eric knew he couldn't approach Grace as himself. Everyone in Kawuna knew him as the wealthy plantation owner, and he wanted her to fall for him, not his money. So he decided to disguise himself as a small coffee supplier named Cunnel. He traded his fine clothes for a simple shirt and trousers, and he left his mansion early the next morning, riding a bicycle into the heart of the village. When he arrived at Grace's Oven, the smell of warm pastries and ripe bananas greeted him like an old friend. The bakery was small but inviting, with wooden tables and colorful curtains. A group of children sat in one corner, nibbling on slices of bread while Grace told them stories. Eric watched her from the doorway. Her laughter filled the room, warm and rich like honey. She had a way of making everyone feel at home. Her apron was dusted with flour, and her dark curly hair was tied up in a bright yellow scarf. "Good morning," Grace called when she noticed him. "Come in, stranger. What can I get for you?" Eric stepped inside, feeling an unfamiliar nervousness. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I sell coffee beans from the farms on the outskirts of the village. I thought you might like to try some for your bakery." Grace's eyes lit up. "Ah, coffee. I've been looking for a new supplier. My customers love a good cup with their pastries." Eric handed her a small sack of beans, and she inspected them with the careful eye of someone who knew her craft. "These look good," she said, nodding. "Let me brew a pot and see how they taste." As Grace brewed the coffee, Eric looked around the bakery. There were shelves filled with golden loaves of bread, jars of jam, and trays of pastries. The walls were decorated with hand-woven baskets and paintings of Kawuna's rolling hills. When Grace brought him a cup of coffee, he took a sip and smiled. "It's perfect," he said. "But I have to know, what's your secret? How do you make everything here so alive?" Grace laughed, a sound that seemed to fill the room with sunlight. "No secret," she said. "I just use what the land gives us. Fresh bananas, sweet cassava, and a lot of love." Eric felt a pang of guilt. She was so genuine, so pure. But he reminded himself of the wager and pushed the thought away. "I'd love to supply you with coffee regularly," he said. "Perhaps I can deliver a sack each week." Grace agreed, and they struck a deal. Eric left the bakery that day with a smile on his face, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Grace was no ordinary woman. Over the next few weeks, Eric, still posing as Cunnel, the humble coffee supplier, made regular visits to Grace's Oven. Each time, he brought a fresh sack of coffee beans and stayed to chat with Grace. At first, Their conversations were strictly about business. Grace would talk about the qualities of different coffee blends, while Eric pretended to listen, secretly marveling at how her passion lit up her face. But soon their talks turned personal. One sunny afternoon, as Grace kneaded dough by the wide window, Eric asked her, "Why did you choose baking, Grace? With your sharp mind, you could have done anything." Grace paused, her hands covered in flour. "Baking reminds me of my mother," she said softly. "She used to make banana bread for us when times were hard. No matter how little we had, she'd always find a way to make something special. I wanted to do the same for my village." Eric nodded, feeling a warmth he couldn't explain. "You're doing more than that," he said. "You've created a place where people feel at home." Grace smiled, but then her eyes turned serious. "And what about you, Colonel? Why coffee?" Eric hesitated. He had prepared for many questions, but this one caught him off guard. "It's a family tradition," he lied, avoiding her gaze. "My father grew coffee, and I've always loved the smell of the beans roasting in the sun." Grace didn't press him further, but Eric felt a pang of guilt. He realized he was no longer just trying to win a bet. He genuinely enjoyed spending time with Grace. Her laughter, her kindness, her strength, it all captivated him. One day, Grace invited Eric to the annual Harvest Festival in Kawuna. It was a vibrant celebration of the land's abundance, with music, dancing, and endless food. The entire village gathered in the square, dressed in colorful traditional attire. Women balanced baskets of fruits on their heads, while children ran around, their laughter echoing through the air. Eric arrived at the festival in his simple disguise, feeling oddly nervous. When he saw Grace, his breath caught. She wore a flowing green dress adorned with patterns of golden leaves, and her headscarf sparkled in the evening light. She looked radiant. "Colonel," she called, waving him over. "Come, join me." They spent the evening together, sampling spicy jollof rice, fried plantains, and sweet coconut candy. Grace introduced Eric to her friends, who teased her about her new coffee supplier. As the night went on, a group of drummers began playing, and the crowd gathered to dance. Grace pulled Eric into the circle, laughing as she swayed to the rhythm. At first, Eric was stiff and awkward, but Grace's joy was infectious. Soon, he found himself laughing and moving to the beat. For the first time in years, Eric felt free from the expectations of wealth and power, free from the loneliness that came with his privileged life. While Eric and Grace grew closer, the villagers began to notice their bond. Some whispered that Grace had finally found a suitor, while others were skeptical of Eric's intentions. One afternoon, as Eric was leaving the bakery, he overheard a group of women talking outside. "Grace is too trusting," one of them said. "What do we know about this Colonel? He could be anyone." "Or he could be no one," another chimed in. "A simple coffee supplier can't offer her much." Eric clenched his fists, resisting the urge to confront them. Instead, he hurried back to his mansion, feeling a growing conflict within him. He had started this charade as a game, a wager to prove his charm. But now he was deeply invested, not in winning, but in Grace herself. That night, as he sat in his grand study, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, Eric made a decision. He would tell Grace the truth about who he was and how their relationship had started. But when? The next morning, Grace woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had been working on a new recipe, banana bread infused with a hint of coffee. She wanted it to reflect the partnership she had built with Colonel. As she baked, she thought about him. There was something mysterious about Colonel. He was kind, but he often seemed guarded, as though he carried a heavy burden. Grace wondered if she'd ever get to know the real man behind his gentle smile. That day, when Eric arrived with his usual sack of coffee beans, Grace surprised him with a fresh loaf of her new creation. "This is for you," she said, handing him the warm bread. "A little thank you for all the wonderful coffee." Eric took a bite and closed his eyes, savoring the rich, bittersweet flavor. "This is incredible, Grace," he said. "You've outdone yourself." Grace beamed. "I call it unity bread. It's a reminder that even the simplest things like bananas and coffee can come together to create something beautiful." Her words struck a chord in Eric. He realized that Grace saw the world differently from anyone he'd ever met. She didn't measure success by wealth or power, but by the connections she made and the joy she brought to others. As Eric and Grace grew closer, Kofi began to grow impatient. He had expected Eric to charm Grace quickly and collect his winnings, but weeks had passed, and there was no sign of a victory. One evening, Kofi visited Eric at his mansion. "What's taking so long?" he demanded. "You're not actually falling for her, are you?" Eric avoided his gaze. "This is more complicated than I thought," he admitted. "Grace isn't like other women." Kofi laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "Don't tell me the great Eric is losing his touch. Remember, this is just a bet. Don't let her fool you." But Eric no longer cared about the wager. He cared about Grace, and he knew that when she found out the truth, it would shatter the trust they had built. Eric sat on the balcony of his mansion, staring out at the rolling hills of his coffee plantation. The wager felt like a noose tightening around his neck. What had begun as a game had turned into something far more serious. His heart, which he once believed was impenetrable, had been captivated by Grace's warmth and unwavering kindness. But as his feelings grew stronger, so did the weight of his secret. He wanted to tell her the truth, but fear held him back. Would she forgive him? Could she ever see past the betrayal and believe his love was real? Eric made up his mind to confess, but not yet. "I need more time," he muttered to himself. Time to prove his intentions were genuine. Time to show Grace who he really was. Not the billionaire, not the man behind the bet, but just Eric. One afternoon, as Eric approached the bakery, he noticed Grace struggling to carry a large sack of cassava flour into her shop. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side. "Here, let me help you," he said, lifting the sack with ease. Grace smiled, wiping the sweat from her brow. "You're always showing up at the right time, Colonel. Maybe I should hire you as my assistant." Eric laughed. "I think you'd run out of work for me pretty quickly. You're far too good at what you do." Inside the bakery, Grace offered him a cup of coffee, and they sat at the small wooden table by the window. As they talked, Eric noticed a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of a younger Grace with an older woman, both laughing as they kneaded dough together. "Is that your mother?" Eric asked. Grace's smile softened. "Yes. She taught me everything I know about baking. She used to say, the best bread comes from hands that love, not just hands that work. I think of her every time I bake." Eric felt a pang in his chest. Grace's life was built on love and authenticity, while his approach to her had been built on lies. The thought of breaking her trust gnawed at him. Meanwhile, whispers about Grace and her mysterious coffee supplier began to spread through Kawuna. Some villagers were happy for her, saying it was about time Grace found someone who appreciated her. Others were less kind. "She deserves better," a woman muttered to her friend at the marketplace. "What can a simple coffee seller offer her?" "He's probably just using her," another replied. "Men like that always have hidden agendas." Grace heard snippets of these conversations but brushed them off. She didn't care what the villagers thought. Cunnel had been nothing but kind and supportive, and that was what mattered. But Eric wasn't as oblivious. On his next visit to the bakery, he noticed the wary looks some villagers gave him. The gossip was becoming harder to ignore. "Does it bother you what people are saying about us?" Grace asked him one day, her tone light but her eyes searching. Eric hesitated. "Not really," he said finally. "People will always talk. What matters is what we know to be true." Grace nodded, satisfied with his answer. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would soon catch up with him. One day, Eric invited Grace to a small banquet at a nearby farm. It was being hosted by a group of local coffee growers, and Eric thought it would be the perfect way to spend more time with her while showcasing her talents. "Your banana bread deserves a wider audience," he said. "Bring a few loaves, and let's see what the coffee growers think." Grace was flattered by the invitation and agreed. The evening of the banquet, she dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, a blue and gold dress that complemented her glowing skin. Eric, who arrived early to escort her, was momentarily speechless when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace blushed. "Thank you. You're not looking too bad yourself." The banquet was lively, with music, laughter, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Grace's banana bread was an instant hit, and several attendees asked for her recipe. Eric watched her with pride, marveling at how easily she charmed everyone she met. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he could be honest with her, where he could share his world without fear. As the banquet wound down, Eric and Grace sat under a large baobab tree, watching the stars. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. "This was a wonderful evening," Grace said. "Thank you for inviting me." "I should be thanking you," Eric replied. "Your bread stole the show." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, until Grace asked, "Connell, do you ever think about the future? What you want your life to look like?" Eric hesitated. "I do," he said carefully, "but it's complicated." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "Why does it feel like you're always holding something back?" Eric's heart raced. This was the moment he could tell her the truth, clear the air, and start fresh. But fear paralyzed him. He wasn't ready. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "I guess I'm just not used to talking about myself." Grace frowned but didn't press him further. Still, her intuition told her something was amiss. Unbeknownst to Eric, Kofi had been keeping a close eye on his progress, or lack thereof. Frustrated by Eric's apparent failure to seal the deal, Kofi decided to intervene. One afternoon, he visited Grace's oven under the pretense of buying bread. After some small talk, he casually mentioned Eric's name. "Have you heard of Eric, the billionaire coffee plantation owner?" Kofi asked, feigning innocence. Grace nodded. "Of course. Everyone in Kawuna knows of him." Kofi smirked. "Did you know he's been acting strangely lately? Disappearing for hours at a time, sneaking around a village." Grace's brow furrowed. "Why are you telling me this?" "No reason," Kofi said with a shrug. "I just thought you should know. Sometimes people aren't who they seem." Grace dismissed the conversation, but Kofi's words planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Who was Connell, really? And why did he seem so familiar yet so mysterious?